Can you hear me, Shelley, from where you are? I assume you can, yeah. Okay,
Yes.
I don't see any oh, I do see 13 attendees.
We are live and we are ready for your introduction.
All right, well then I am going to give my introduction and I'm going to welcome everybody. Thank you all for joining us. We may have more people joining us over the next couple of minutes, but it's a thrill to have the speaker series back again. Some of you may have joined us when we had a meeting a few months ago. We talked about the future of rural Oregon. We're going very urban today. I'm David Barnard, who I'm a member of the speaker series committee. Our chair is Kay Abramowitz. Our other members are Kate Turan, George Granger, and Tom Smith. And it's been a pleasure working with them. Our next event after tonight will take place in October. And we'll just encourage you to watch for the details about that. One other housekeeping matter for tonight, we plan to have a conversation with our two guests who I'll be introducing to you very shortly, maybe for half an hour or so. And then we want to reserve a lot of time for all of you who are participating to make comments, ask questions, and you can do that by clicking on the little yellow raise hand symbol down at, I assume it's down at the bottom of your screen, and I'll be able to notice when those hands go up next to your name, and we'll try to call on you and give you an opportunity to chat with us. Shelley asked me to warn you that while you're asking your question or making your comment, you will be on camera. So just look about you and see that you're prepared for that event. Our theme for today is Portland's post-pandemic future. And there are many facets to this theme. And the speaker series plans to explore a number of those facets over the coming months. We've been living through quite tumultuous times, and we want us to look ahead. To start us off, we have two guests this evening. One is Skip Newberry, who is the president and CEO of the Technology Association of Oregon. And our second guest is Andrew Hoan, who is the president and CEO of the Portland Business Alliance. I have to say, I'm not the president and CEO of anything, but you'll just have to bear with me on that. But I want to tell you something about both Skip and Andrew before we begin. Skip Newberry is a frequent speaker on topics related to technology and trends in entrepreneurship, policies related to economic development, public-private partnerships, and civic innovation. Before he joined the Technology Association of Oregon, Skip was economic development policy advisor to Portland's Mayor Sam Adams, where he helped create Portland's first comprehensive economic development strategy in 16 years, recognizing software as a key industry cluster. While at the city of Portland, Skip's projects included the adoption of the nation's first open source software procurement policy at the municipal level, an award-winning regional open data initiative, and the development of resources to support entrepreneurship like the Portland Seed Fund. Skip in 2011 received the Society of Professional Journalists' first Freedom Award. In 2012, he was a recipient of the Portland Business Journal's 40 Under 40 Award. And in 2020, he received the Oregon League of Minority Voters Liberty and Hope Award. Really delighted that Skip is with us tonight. Andrew Hoan came to Portland 3 years ago. Actually, he mentioned earlier, 2 days from now, it will be exactly 3 years. from Brooklyn. He was the president and the CEO of the Brooklyn Chamber of Commerce, a role that he held since 2016. He managed the fiscal, strategic, and programmatic goals for the Brooklyn Chamber and the Brooklyn Alliance, and served as a spokesperson for economic development and business throughout the borough. Previously, he served as executive vice president and chief of staff at the Brooklyn Chamber under its former president and CEO, Carlo Chisura. Joined the chamber in 2012 as vice president of economic development. He's from Milwaukee originally, and has served on the boards of a variety of economic development and civic organizations. And I need to ask you, Andrew, when they recruited you to come to Portland, did they tell you about the earthquake?
Cascadia was not in the job description, no.
No, and it wasn't in mine either when I came in 2012. So
Or
there's been
volcanoes.
yeah, right. Okay. Before I begin our conversation about Portland's post-pandemic future with Andrew and Skip, I do want to mention the elephant in the room, which is the sad state of Portland's downtown. And here, as if we really needed it, is a very succinct statement about that from Patrick McNulty, who is the principal of Carbon LLC, a local development company, as he was quoted in the Northwest Examiner, saying, "Homelessness, lawlessness, cleanliness, and accessibility to public space are all fundamental issues governments are supposed to manage. Currently, many of those issues aren't being dealt with by countless administrations nationwide. And it is creating a problem for storefronts, streetscapes, public spaces, residents, renters, owners, investors, or even the governments themselves." And I think we know that those problems are very much in the minds of people who live in Portland today. And we suspect that anyone tuning into this program will have these concerns at the top of your minds, but that's not really what we plan to talk about tonight. So I'm going to ask you to just ignore that elephant. Don't let him step on you. And what we'd like to talk about, though these are obviously extremely critical issues, and our political leaders need to face them more effectively than they have so far, we'd like to ask you to look beyond the immediate present situation in Portland and try to envision the future of our city in relation to trends and social forces that have emerged during the COVID pandemic. It's certainly true that the problems that we just enumerated were aggravated by the pandemic, and it's hard to separate our future from those immediate problems of our daily quality of life. Nevertheless, for purposes of this event, and to take advantage particularly of Skip's and Andrew's experience and expertise, I'm going to ask us to focus on larger questions of how Portlanders are likely to organize our lives as we emerge after more than a year of adapting to the challenges of the pandemic. And this means looking at the future of work, play, entertainment, housing, transportation, the whole gamut of living in the post-COVID years ahead. So to do this with Andrew and Skip, I prepared a few questions that I would like to ask them. We're going to discuss them amongst ourselves. Each question will go to one of the two initially, but they're both, I think, ready and eager to jump in. So I'm going to start, Skip, with you. And my question to you is, what comes after Zoom? By which I mean, will communication and networking technologies continue to evolve and improve in ways that will make remote working, learning, entertainment, conferences, conventions easier and more productive?
Yes, that's the short answer. And I'll say that there's a number of companies here that are at the forefront of that. We do work with Brand Live, which was a company that had 14 employees at the start of the pandemic, and they now have over 200. They did a lot of work with the Democratic Party during this recent election, and really arrived big time on the national stage through their event platform. And they focus mainly around corporate events. So when you're thinking about like stand-ups or meetings, and they're really focused in on content. And so what I think a lot of people have realized is that Zoom was an interesting sort of first platform out of the gate that opened up people's eyes to, there are possibilities here for meetings, and it's somewhat like an in-person conversation, but there's also Zoom fatigue, which is very real, where people are exhausted at the end of the day because they've been staring at other folks, and people have started to question, well, can we do this over the phone? And do we need all the bells and whistles, like, doing polls and other types of features around the video screen within the platform? And so a lot of companies are already learning a ton around what they've seen in terms of how people interact with these platforms. And I think we're going to continue to see a lot of innovation coming out of the pandemic. I think also people are questioning, why do I need to attend something in person, whether it's a meeting or a trade show or a conference? And so I think what we're seeing is that people are getting down to the why am I doing this? And then does the technology serve that end? And same thing with the amount of time it takes to do an in-person meeting or a trade show. What's the trade-off? We've seen productivity go through the roof, and that's been enabled by a lot of these tech platforms. And frankly, we've seen it translate into growth among the companies that are here, and also the overall resilience of the tech sector has been quite strong during the pandemic. It's actually enabled a lot of companies to not just survive, but thrive.
Okay, Andrew, do you want to comment on that from the perspective of the companies and the employers that you deal with?
Be thrilled to. And of course, first off, David, thank you for moderating this. And it's really fun to be on a panel with Skip, of course. And big fan of Kate Turan's, who initially reached out to us, I used to be an employee of Volunteers of America and worked in the shelter system in New York City. And so the work that she does is incredible. George Granger with AT&T, whom you mentioned, is on my board along with Skip. So just a lot of love going around. And just to all of you out there, just thanks for being here tonight on what is slowly, I assume, maybe the last or an evolution of virtual events where we'll start to transition back into the in-person experience. And I think, or some version of a hybrid, which is really at the crux of this conversation. So I do want to center a little bit and not get away from the gorilla, elephant, or whatever, monster you want to talk about in the room, and actually reflect back a little bit on where Portland's come, and also remind people who we are. And, I'm proudly Portland, so I'm here to strongly represent, despite all of our, the flies in the ointment. But in February of 2020, so well over a year ago, pre-pandemic Portland and really the U.S. economy was at the longest economic expansion in post-war history. I mean, it was, when is this going to end question. And then as a regional economy, Portland had outpaced the U.S. economy for a decade in job creation. Then March of 2020, the downtown core, where we would all be sitting right now if we were in person, had 100,000 office workers and a 4% retail vacancy rate, which is, for any center city would have been something to celebrate. Then by the end of March, all that was gone. It evaporated practically overnight, and in a way that was so rapid. The adoption of technology and the way that businesses were able to pivot was profound, driven by necessity. Fast forward it a little bit and you look at the retail scene overall in downtown. As of September, there's 718 retail locations in the 213 blocks, which are downtown Portland Clean Safe, which is the enhanced service district that we operate. Only 430 of those remained open. I mean, the wake of the devastation and the changes and their impact to streetscapes, the way that we visualize our center city, were profound. And then the good news is that on May 27th, low risk was announced by the state, and that injected the hyperfuel, which is the economy, or what drives the economy, which is the office workers, who are starting to return back. And when I say starting, I want to draw a distinction between how fast the consequences of closures hit versus how long it will take to recover. So we all learned the tools of the trade that Skip talked about, but then returning to human connection or in-person existence is a vastly more complicated question and a vastly more difficult solution. And I'll never forget, we had a pollster come join our board in April of last year and made the same point about politicians. They were at their peak of popularity in April 2020. And then he made the point that going forward, all the decisions are terrible and difficult. You open too fast, you kill people. You stay closed too long, you keep people alive. It's a lose-lose situation. And similarly, companies, in terms of how they're going to be moving forward with technology and the adoption of a different type of lifestyle, are answering questions which are vastly more difficult than stay home, use technology, and learn. Because we all know this, I'm sure you're feeling it the same way. People's use of technologies and their proclivity to be in person or connect, or how they interface with people, is completely a scattershot. And so, in answer to your question about what does the future look like post Zoom, yes, it is clearly better. It is a more adapted society to things that we already had access to. However, the question's kind of more big picture about what kind of a world do we want to live in when it comes to the returning to human connection. And I think the bigger aspects of that question you're asking are, how do we define ourselves as people? How do we connect with one another? And what does that look like? Which is kind of an old school question. So it's a juxtaposition of really wild dynamics. And we're writing the script as we go. So glad to be part of the prognosticator panel right now. Up, David, you're doing the old, you've got the Zoom, you got your mute button on. You're a veteran now. You're supposed to.
Okay, there we go. Thank you. I want to get back to Skip and ask. There's probably been a lot of money and venture capital put into these technologies to facilitate virtual transactions, business, conventions, all kinds of office life. Is that all going to turn out to be sort of a misguided set of investments, or are these companies have a big stake in slowing down the recovery of human contact, don't they?
I think it's an interesting question. I mean, it's in terms of venture capital, yeah, chances are it's going to result in a number of failures, and that's the whole nature of venture capital, is making some big bets. And right now, you're right. There was a lot of venture capital that flowed into a variety of these platforms during the pandemic, on the assumption that the pandemic was going to accelerate these trends and these transitions to, virtual meetings, virtual events, and then also how people do their work and do their learning and access healthcare and access government services and the like. So I think that what we're seeing is, what are the things that are going to be long lasting? And to Andrew's point, I think there's been a big sort of reckoning or series of questions that both people and businesses and institutions are asking themselves, which is, at the end of this thing, or even if it doesn't end per se, when we arrive at the new normal, what do we want that to look like? And there is a certain amount of agency there, which is, I think, an important consideration. We have some control over asking and defining the right questions and then applying technology or shaping it kind of to meet those goals. And I think we're seeing that a bit. There's also some pushback that we're seeing in certain areas where power has shifted quite a bit over the last year, among different groups, among different institutions. And that also has some profound repercussions. Technology is an interesting tool in the mix of that can kind of tip the power balances one way or the other. And I think there's a lot of good questions being asked around how can technology be a tool to improve access? How can it be a tool to improve service delivery? But there's also some negative repercussions as well. So in what ways is it exacerbating inequity, right, with the digital divide? And so as more things move online, we have a lot of questions about, okay, where do we need to intervene in the public sector? Where can the private sector intervene and fill some of the gaps so that people get greater access to the technologies and services that are enabled by them in this new normal? So those are some of the bigger questions that I know a lot of our members are wrestling with, and of course, a lot of the folks that they serve as well.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and I want to come back to the issue of the divides in our population a little bit later. But first, I want to go back and do something to Andrew that I hate when people do to me, and that is read a quote that he gave to a newspaper and ask him if he still agrees with himself. Okay. The Oregonian quoted you, Andrew, saying that this was in May 21st, I think. You will start to see more people on the streets, and people's impressions of downtown and their willingness to spend money downtown and visit downtown will change. At this point, we're in a moment of uncertainty that will be much more clearly understood after Memorial Day. And I'm wondering, how does that look to you? And as a little bit of an addendum to that question, I'm thinking with this issue of the impact of the greater availability of really effective virtual technologies, a number of the business sectors that I could think of potentially being impacted by a significant, even not 100% shift to virtual working, learning, entertainment, and so forth, would be the real estate market, small businesses that cater to office workers, hotel business and conventions. We just built a 500-room convention center hotel, and I'm wondering what the investors in that enterprise have been thinking about the last year or so. And they probably look at Skip and say, "Hey, get out of here, man! You're ruining our business model." So, are there going to be some system? The transit system is another example that their business model may be affected. So I'm wondering, will different sectors of our business community be affected differently as we move forward into a technological future?
Well, let me start with the last and go back to the first. My sympathies to the hotel you mentioned, because they really did. I can't remember their big precise open date, but it was December or January.
Yeah.
So it was either 2019 or the beginning of 2020. Yeah. And boy, what a really poor timing to open up a hotel business based on convention. So, however, I've had a lot of conversations with them. They're actually quite pleased with a bit of a turnaround in the hotel industry. And I would actually share with you as a counter that on Memorial Day, because I think that was a key indicator for a lot in the travel trade sector, there was 77% occupancy rate in the center city. Now, for those of you keeping score, that's a lot. Actually, on a real estate front, to tie it into your question on commercial activity and commercial investment in property, anytime you flex over 70% on occupancy rate, it's a signal to the development community, the finance industry, that that's the time to start building more rooms, which is quite shocking. And it was a little bit of an outlier because it was Memorial Day and it's a high peak travel time, and because it was exacerbated by the fact that some hotels are actually still closed. So this was not a full representation of the keys we have relative to the traveler industry. And so I just want to say that there's some bright spots. In fact, the Chinese Garden in Old Town, which I know many of you are just, for those that see Old Town visually, it's a very different place because of the impacts of unsheltered and from just an overwhelming problematic vacancy rate on a retail front. They had the same attendance rate on Memorial Day of 2021 as they did in 2019. So we're seeing those signals. Back to your original point, that quote was brilliant. What are you talking about? It's the best quote I've ever given in my life.
Okay. Would you like me to read it again in case anybody missed it?
It's like pouring honey down my ears. So I will say this, I'm going to read you a storyline that came out right after that. So on June 5th, front page of the digital section of the Oregonian, so just on the app or wherever you were, quote, here's the title: Portland's largest downtown employers express commitment to city core as they plan return to office. Boom. That was the huge signal we were talking about in that quote, because it was broadly understood as we moved to low risk that this was the welcoming of office. So number one, we reached that threshold from vaccination. If you haven't gotten vaccinated, get with the program. But anyway, so that answered that question immediately, because you saw whether it was Stoll Reeves or US Bank or some of the huge drivers of office employment downtown saying we're coming back and we're doubling down. And then we've done polling recently, actually, Skip's former employer, Sam Adams, who, really has been running a lot of these interesting tables, bringing people together, fielded a poll on the dispensation towards people to travel back to downtown outside of office work. And I want to just give you a couple of anecdotal pieces here that are meaningful. So pre-COVID, people that were older than 45 and who had incomes of greater than $150,000 were frequenting the city. That's who we had coming downtown. Now, it's 18 to 29-year-olds with mid-range incomes frequenting the city center who are interested in fun stuff to do, like farmers markets and food carts, things of that nature. So you're seeing a shift in who wants to use our downtown core. And so broadly, I think one thing that blew my mind away, or I think we'll all be grappling with, and I don't have the answer to it. Skip probably knows better than I don't know. But this one, I just searched out prior to jumping on this call, but CNBC had a great story around my one son losing his mind in the background, in case you can't hear him, about employees and how they're experiencing the return to work. And I'll read this quote. Some employees have enjoyed the flexibility of working from home so much that one survey of 1,000 US adults found that 39% would consider quitting if their employees weren't flexible about remote work moving forward. That's a lot of people saying, I don't even want to work anymore. 40% is a high water mark for people saying, I'm out if there's not flexibility built into the way that I come back to work. And that has ramifications for the commercial sector, like you stated, that we are not yet grappling with, and which will reshape probably urban cores, especially on what does the office market look like and what's the mix, whether we're bringing more residential into the marketplace as a result of these sort of loosening or easing of the vacancy rates within office. And maybe that's the way it should be, but we just don't know right now.
That statistic you just quoted is a little different in tone from the upbeat story in the Oregonian. Where do you come out in your own estimation of how we should be thinking about this future?
I said Memorial Day was a key marker. It was true. That's when we moved to low risk. The second marker we're looking at is Labor Day, because that's when Portland Public Schools returns to in-person for those of us with school-age children. It's not that people are somehow figuring out what to do with their kids over the summer in a new way, but broadly speaking, normalizing family routines to permit the ability for families to actually come back in person, or those that are caring for elders, is really going to be decided Labor Day. And then also how the city responds, broadly speaking, to being a better city on basic services. And so the test cases now, and those how we respond as a city and as a community will provide two simple divergent pathways. Either we're going to be kind of different model downtown or in broad office markets, or we're going to go another direction, and we just don't know what that is right now.
Okay.
But I'm still optimistic. I'm all in on Portland.
I hear that.
Hey, David, if I may, I just had a couple of comments there.
Please.
Following on that. And so I saw Rick posted in the Q&A about a city poll of city employees and willingness to return to downtown. And I think what would be interesting is to see whether there were more specific follow-up questions asked, because just that question alone doesn't really give me a lot of good information to go on. Like what we found is that goes across a lot of sectors, and it's frankly because people found that with remote work that there is some greater flexibility and productivity and time with family and kids, and they're not stuck in a car commuting necessarily. So a whole host of reasons why they might favor being at home and working remotely at least some of the week. And what we're seeing is companies are, as they reopen, saying at the employer level, yeah, we're bringing people back. But in a lot of cases, they're trying to figure out, like, okay, what inducements do we need to put into place to get people back more often than not? And at least among a lot of the tech companies that we work with, they're trying to figure out how do they build out even like more extravagant office spaces with more amenities. And they're also thinking very critically around, like, why do people need to be meeting or in person during a given day? and defining what those processes and the business outcomes are and how people contribute and in what way and how offices are designed are all things that are in flux right now. And I think that's a good thing ultimately, because people are now pressuring their employers to say, I want to know how you're going to be using my time most efficiently. And you better have a pretty compelling business reason in terms of why I need to spend, X amount of time commuting to and from a particular location, and why, when there, I need to be in an open environment, with a whole like cacophonous environment, a lot of noise, and I can't do the work that you're paying me to do. And so it's caused a lot of folks to rethink things. And in fact, some companies we're seeing are actually expanding their office footprint because they're like, we need to do more bells and whistles and have more spaces that are available. So that on the net, it could be good for commercial real estate, even though there's fewer people packed in elbow to elbow. So that has repercussions for retail downtown and the businesses that were serving people lunch and breakfast and happy hour for work. Now, granted, there is a positive here if the city can figure out workforce housing, because to Andrew's point, there's a lot of folks who are relatively young in their careers who are clamoring to get back in the office like yesterday. And they want the networking, the FaceTime, the mentorship, the visibility with leadership. And frankly, being in a 1-bedroom studio with your roommate is not all that great during the pandemic for the last year and a half. And I have a couple people on my team that have been like, get me back in the office, right? and so and so how do we kind of reimagine, frankly, downtown to have a lot of folks who need workforce housing are earning decent wages and then want to spend their money 24/7? That's potentially an even better outcome than we were pre-pandemic. So anyway, there's some creative solutions possible, and I know I'm not an expert on any of those things.
Okay, well, that's helpful. I want to pick up one more aspect of the advancing technology question, especially while we have you. And this is a question, though, for both you and Andrew. There is clearly a divide in people's access to broadband. And in some cases, this probably had fatal consequences for people who have not been able to figure out how you use a computer to get a vaccine appointment, and they got shut out. And this divide really has a urban-rural dimension, a minority white population dimension, and a rich-poor dimension. And I guess my question to both of you is as we look ahead to increasing capabilities that are coming through technology, what are technology companies and other businesses, other parts of the business community going to do to make sure that that future does not widen even further the divides in our society between these groups who are now living out so much inequality? Maybe since I've been picking on you, Skip, I'll start by picking on Andrew and then come back to you.
Yeah, no, this isn't a picking. This is the right conversation because realistically, I mean, our culture is sick from the disparities of race and gender identity and everything else. We have a problem, and it was made worse and even more evident by the pandemic. And for the way that I viewed from just economic standpoint, we've been diving into, this takes a geographic scope to the question around disparity. But East County, if you take Multnomah County alone in the state of Oregon, right, it's the wealthiest county that is part of the state. If you divide it east of 82nd or 205, depending on your definitions, you have the wealthiest on one side and the poorest on the other. And then you've heard me talk about before 100,000 jobs in downtown. Well, there are 100,000 jobs in East County, and here's the stuff that just floors me: 60% of the people that live in East County are rent burdened. 70% of those residents east of 82nd don't live where they work. I mean, think about the massive implications of moving as far and wide as an individual has to already. if you look at what COVID did to the economy, right, we were really good. 42 cases per 100,000 per capita, right, versus the rest of the nation, which is around 124 cases per capita of 100,000. And that saved 2,000 lives as of December. So we know we shut the economy down to save lives. But what was hit the hardest? Retail, food and beverage, accommodation. Who were serving those industries? What employees were there? Those are disproportionately minority women, really operated businesses. 33% more women exited the workforce than men during the pandemic. That is a gender gap that has been made worse, right? I mean, you think about the consequences on a career when you exit the workforce. This isn't just I lost my job. This is I am out of the workforce. I'm not even seeking work. Then a survey by the US Census in 2020 found that 28% of Black households reported that paying basic costs was now a struggle versus 18% of white households. So it just goes on and on and on. And then in the region here in Portland, I mean, this is a state founded on exclusion laws. And you have to acknowledge that. And white median household income, we're talking median household income, the average experience was double that of Black income in the region. And this has been made worse by the pandemic. So you have these layering impacts on top of an already bad situation. For me, it came down geography, and I'll share a little bit on the East County piece of this, but how do we close these gaps going forward? The problem now is that the reaction to the widespread, racial equity movements across the country is already starting to feel temporary. And if you talk to a lot of people doing racial advocacy, all those proud promises now are starting to dwindle, and there's a regression towards the old way of doing business because frankly, people are tired and they kind of want to return to the way things were, and that's all right. But it is a massive problem because we will be back here on the disparities question every single year and decades to follow if we don't permanently fix the inequities in our society. I know that's a big topic, but Brett, glad you called it out. And it's the one thing that we haven't fixed, and it was actually made worse by the pandemic.
Yeah. And so now if I could go back to Skip and just stay, and I appreciate those comments, Andrew, very much. We have talked some at previous speaker series programs about issues of diversity and inclusion. But we're seeing the impact of this in lives and deaths right in this past year. And I'm glad that you emphasized that. But Skip, what can we do? I know you mentioned George Granger, and he helped put this panel together, and is he at AT&T? They think a lot about broadband access in rural areas. And what kind of policies do we need to make sure that all these advances are not actually leaving people further and further behind?
Yeah, I'll say that, one good thing that's come out of this is just sort of the spotlight that's been shown on this particular issue and the awareness on the part of the public sector. For years now, as George can attest, we've been trying to talk about how important broadband and wireless connectivity is in all parts of the state. And I can't say that a lot of elected officials were all that eager to talk about it. There were some exceptions here and there. And this legislative session at the state level, it's all anyone was talking about. And you look at the number of bills that were put forward on things like telemedicine or education, it's really because all the constituents in these districts were saying, hey, I can't get access to this critical service. Why is that? Oh, well, it turns out there isn't connectivity in a particular area, or it turns out this person needs technical services to know how to access those services online. Or it could be that this person doesn't have a device that works efficiently, based on how much the technology on the broadband and wireless side is advanced. And so there's really three issues to the digital divide. And you can't just solve it by more broadband, more wireless, et cetera. It's also recognizing that there is an educational divide, a familiarity with how to access and utilize online services. And then there's also the device piece of it. And so it's complex, right? It's multifaceted. And so a lot of the great work that's been done over the last year, and frankly, predated the pandemic, just wasn't as visible then. Free Geek locally, we did a number of partnerships with them, not only in Portland, but also around the state, where we did donation drives among tech companies and employees, where last year they were able to essentially give devices that would then be refurbished by Free Geek And they provide training as well to people from historically disadvantaged backgrounds to learn technical skills, computer repair. And those who are most in need, whether it's school districts, whether it's folks who just need it to access basic health services, et cetera. And it's a really great service. And they've grown quite a bit because the need is so great. But even with all of their resources and all the money flowing through there, it's still not enough. And so you also have companies like AT&T and Comcast and others that have programs that they've set up over years to help try and provide some of these holistic services and products to folks so that they can kind of bridge that digital divide. And then the other thing that I'll say is that, you know, there's some nonprofits and also some of the public sector has said, hey, if there are areas where there's no market incentive to kind of build out some of this infrastructure, can we identify those areas, and are there opportunities to leverage existing backbone or connectivity to kind of just go that last mile and get people enough so that they can at least get online to do the basics? And what's really sad is that, you know, you had people that were, you know, trying to do remote learning from a car in a McDonald's parking lot just so they could get access to wireless services, right? And so all of that came to light in a big way, like it wasn't as visible before the pandemic. And so it's a big issue. And I think, frankly, we're seeing a lot of federal interest in and money trying to incentivize a variety of different types of investment in infrastructure. But the reality in all this is that we have to be mindful of how expensive it is to not only build it, but then also maintain it and upgrade it. And so as much as there's lots of conversations that come up every X number of years around, we need to build our own governmental network. Okay, but building it's one thing, then you need to maintain it and upgrade it, and you have to have customer service and all the rest, and it's incredibly expensive. And so thinking about how does the public intervene in areas where the market is failing, but then also how does the public make it easier for private entities to invest, to go that extra mile and get the services where people need it most.
Yeah, I think it's probably worth commenting that it's also very expensive to have a large segment of a community's population unable to function and keep up with the rest of their community for access to healthcare and financial services and everything else. So I would see these things as real investments that would really pay off in the long run. But I could have this conversation go on all night, but I would like to step back and encourage our people who are watching this to pitch in now. I'm sure they must have some thoughts and questions. You already picked up a little bit on Rick Caskey's question about the city workers that was in the chat. But if any of you are interested in commenting or asking things, please hit the red raise hand button and we will have you on screen. Anyone? Okay, not yet. Okay. Well, then let me tell you about a new word that Andrew taught me in preparing for this presentation, and maybe this will prompt some people to think about it. And the word shows up at the end of this next question that I'm going to ask. And this is a question that Andrew proposed that I bring up so he could get ready for it and look really smart. And the question is this: in what ways will the city or the state's approach to economic development need to change in order for the region to attract and retain a diverse and talented traded sector workforce? Now, I don't know about you, I'd never heard the expression traded sector before, but I went online naturally and said that, found out that traded sector businesses are those whose products compete either with corporations and businesses in other states or in other nations. And that's different from a local business, like a little sandwich shop on the corner. They're not in competition with the sandwich shop in the next state. But companies that make things and provide services that are also provided by other places globally, they need a really well-educated workforce. and you need, it appears that you really want to attract a highly educated workforce. And not only did I see a definition of traded sector, but I also found a chart that showed where Portland ranks in cities according to the percentage of their workforce that has a four-year college education. And we're sort of around the middle of the pack nationally. Around just over 30% of Portland's workforce has a college education. San Jose is at the top with over 45%. And there's probably about 20 cities between San Jose and Portland on this graph who have a more college educated workforce than we do. So I guess I'll ask you, Andrew, since you brought this up, what does Portland need to do to encourage people to move here who will allow our businesses to really compete on a global basis?
I give
I'm
them
sorry,
all an
Andrew.
iPhone. I don't know. No, sorry. Well, I would point out first, everyone should be proud of the fact that we are a trade sector region. And there are 12, so everyone knows that the United States is a trade deficit nation. We bring in more stuff than we send out in terms of the total value. Of all 50 states, there are only 12 states which are trade surplus states. In other words, they send out more stuff internationally than they bring in. Of those 12 states, only 2 are not dependent on mineral extraction of some sort of resource economy, such as like Louisiana, for example, is a trade surplus state. It's all dependent on Gulf oil. Oregon and Washington are trade surplus states that are predicated on value-added manufacturing. So we take in stuff from other places, we make it better, and then we send it out. And just in the Portland region, actually 1/5 of all jobs are dependent on some form of that type of trade. And why were we built here? Why were we founded here? We are on the crossroads of water. We are on the Pacific Rim. You know, if you read Astoria and John Jacob Astor's trying to connect the dots between New York and the Pacific Northwest and China, and then back to New York again, it was about bringing together and knitting the global economy through all these things. So that's a good thing. From how do you attract talent? First, shockingly, people have asked this question a lot. You know, we've added a 6th congressional district per our last census.
Mm-hmm.
So people have been moving here over the decade. Demographic trends continue to remain positive. And then everyone's asked the question, well, what about the last year? Clearly, we're screwed, right? But that's not true. 18,000 net new households were created in the last year. So that should floor everyone. So people are still moving here. The question to the diversity of the workforce is really interesting. So while diverse candidates are moving here and the region's rapidly diversifying, we have categorically failed to retain candidates that come from diverse backgrounds. And actually, it's too long to go into, but I will circulate in the chat function a deep analysis that our organization performed through Partners in Diversity. I know many are members, around how do you retain diverse candidates. So the question of what do you do? It's first off, we're doing it, whatever it is, the quality of life is still there. And then the antidote towards how do you continue to attract people here, top talent. We've forgotten how to do the basics in government, which is to provide basic public cleanliness, basic safety, basic everything. We got to get back to the basics and just remind people that quality of life is the selling point of why people come here and stay here. And we have to make sure that we are focused on that in a way that may seem boring because it's not a sexy answer, but it is the answer for how do you keep a happy workforce.
Okay, thank you. And now I do want to acknowledge Sierra Modro, who has her hand raised. So Shelley, if you can bring her into the conversation, I'd like to hear from you. There she is.
Yep.
Okay, you'll need to unmute. I think you're muted, Sierra.
You can unmute her, right?
Oh, now we can hear you. Oh, Shelley, come to our rescue.
I am trying. I've asked if they want to unmute, and I think they have to do it themselves.
Okay, Sierra, if you can hear us, there you go.
All right, so we're unmuted. I'm Chuck Deaver, and I'm asking this question. So I remember a city where, or a downtown area where that was filled with individual businesses and entrepreneurs. And according to your numbers, pre-pandemic, there were 718 of these businesses, and now there are 430. And I kind of question that because when I walk through downtown, I see businesses that are boarded up, businesses that have been violated. I can remember a wonderful town where you had a major chain like Target on one side of the street and an individual jeweler on the other side of the street. And it was a wonderful place to come to. And how are we going to recreate that? Because it was special in Portland. And I think that's one of the reasons a lot of us come downtown. And I think we have to pay attention to that. And the large demographic numbers and the number of businesses that are coming back and the people that are going to work here are fine. And maybe somebody will open up a little sandwich shop here and there. But the heart of this city was those people that had been here for years and years and years and now have plywood over their windows if they're still in business. And if they're not in business, they've been, looted and burned out and moved. And I think we should address that in this conversation.
Great question. And anyone that walks around downtown should be just, it's heartbreaking, right? And on many levels, right, emotive, right, where you see a visual representation of the impacts of COVID, political violence, let's call it what it is. There's protests and peaceful demonstrations, and that's well and good, but there's political violence, which we have been scarred by. And that has a physical representation. There's the deprivation of office workers who have completely taken the air out of the retail scene, hospitality scene. There's a lack of tourism because of reputational harm. I mean, the compounding, issues that challenge retailers. So I don't want to paint a rosy picture by any means. I still think there's a categorical sadness in the numbers I was telling about the loss of retail, and also to the style of Portland retail, which is, you mentioned a couple of the big box, but it's actually was really boutique and mom and pop and a little bit more, reflective of the good quirky nature of Portland and being, that you can find really unusual destination retail. And we've lost a lot of that. So there's no question. And we were at 4% retail vacancy before the pandemic. So the loss is enormous. And that's why you're feeling that way. So yes, the reality is what the activity we have seen now in the last 2 months, in particular, from where we were in December, we did a pedestrian count in December. It was off 80% year on year. And to where we are today, where we're regaining that human traffic on the streets for the pedestrian experience, couldn't be more night and day. And so I'm bullish on the fact that, one, retail will be rewritten in downtown. Landlords are offering incentives in terms of moving into spaces, especially even for, I will say this right now because I know they're seeking a tenant. World Trade Center is looking for effectively free rent for a year if you're a BIPOC-owned business retailer. And so those sort of questions about what comes next is being written now. And we're actually seeing a lot of return and positive trends in retail. And they're seeing more people coming into their stores than they were before the pandemic. There's sort of a urgency to shopping. And I think you've heard stories about the used car economy. Well, it's true now in retail. People are truly opening up their wallets. And I think there's positive trends. It's shaky. And we need these positive trends to be maintained well over a year. This is a 2 to 3 year recovery. So I'm not promising a rosy picture. It's dark and gloomy, but we're seeing the green shoots of recovery, and in a good way, and in a different way, the way World Trade Center is thinking about it. Not just the usual retailer. I want someone who is a person of color to occupy the ground floor space and to do something creative. And so I think that's the right solution.
Okay.
David, I was just going to say that, tying a couple of these together just briefly, there's, I think, an opportunity to focus on an economic strategy for the region that is both pro-growth, but also mindful of the fact that companies and institutions need to be thinking about their corporate culture so that it's inclusive and diverse. And so it's not just about developing talent locally, but also attracting talent here and giving opportunity to those who are both relocating as well as coming up through Portland, right?
Yeah.
Who have grown up here and are looking for career opportunities.
Yeah.
And right now, I think what we can't lose sight of as a community is the importance of growing, especially those engines of economic activity like traded sector. So the more traded sector firms, the bigger the growth opportunities, the more potential for companies to scale in the region, the greater opportunity for wealth creation across the board for all of their employees and for the folks who were involved in starting the company. And you look at areas that have diversified over a long period of time, multiple generations in the US, they've done so really in environments that you could actually look at in terms of policy and say they're quite hostile to equity and diversity. But yet places like Atlanta have thrived economically, and they've also thrived in terms of multi-generational wealth transfer among especially the Black community. And entrepreneurship and everything else is because there's large corporations that have sprung up there that have given people opportunity and training that then allows them to create startups, and they build their own businesses and they create multi-generational wealth and they mentor the next up and comers. And so really, I think Portland has an ethos of entrepreneurship and quirkiness and kind of creativity. And we need to be thinking about how we allow those ideas to flourish to their ultimate sort of end, including big organizations and really successful businesses. And with that, we're going to get some of the diversity and economic opportunity outcomes that come with it.
Okay, thank you. We've got time for just a couple more questions, and they're both going to come from a person named Kay. Our committee happens, as I think you heard me say at the very beginning, we have two Ks on our committee, and they're both interested in getting in on this. And I'll start with you, Kay Turan, who has her hand up. Shelley, can you bring Kay into the mix here?
She is there.
Okay, Kay, are you there? Suddenly I'm not seeing it. Let's see.
We
Oh,
got
yeah.
her. She's just
She's
working
there.
on that
She's
mute
just-
unmute.
She's muted, yeah. Have to unmute her. There it is.
I do know she has the question listed in the chat that maybe can be answered.
Well, let me take a look. Okay. All right. Now, what I'm seeing in the chat is you answer how we recruit major headquarters. We lost US and Wells Fargo, US Bank, I guess, Wells Fargo, Louisiana Pacific, Boise Cascade, etc. I hope I'm bringing this out as you wanted to, Kay. Any comments about recruiting headquarters to Portland from either of you?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, I'd say the big companies.
Yeah, I'd say we've lost a couple of headquarters in tech during the pandemic, where they shifted operations to business friendlier environments. And it's not to say that that is a trend, but I think that as companies become flatter and people can work anywhere and companies are hiring everywhere, you're going to see concentrations of talent in markets that are growing. And there's a proclivity for companies to want to shift headquarters to where the talent bases are and also where they're going to get some sort of business advantage. And so we have to be mindful of the fact that, just because a headquarters starts here doesn't mean it's always going to stay here. And we have to be thinking about how do we enable those companies to scale and grow and thrive at all different stages. And so really for me, it's about how do we help the companies that are already here and could start here get to that level where they become a significant headquarters operations, because we can't afford to lose it and just be a town of essentially satellite offices. And I think that part of that is dependent on the policies that we have here from a workforce standpoint, and also how businesses operate. Yep.
Andrew?
I'll layer on. I mean, it's a great question. We certainly, anyone who grew up here knows that there's been a lot of exodus of the corporate HQ, and we have to cherish those that remain here, and we appreciate that they are. And whether it's Nike or the Standard, is these corporate citizenship centered in this region make a difference on so many levels, whether it's just engagement with community, expenditures on charitable causes. It just makes a difference. What I would say is that the challenge that we're facing right now is Oregon went from being the 40th lowest in business taxes or impact to businesses to being the 19th highest in 3 years. And so the taxing structure here, which is just kind of ludicrous in our dependency on various types of mechanisms that are really challenged our ability to attract talent, or excuse me, attract corporate headquarters on a pure dollars basis, we're sort of bereft of right now. And so I think what Skip's talking about is ultimately the solution is it's all about the human element. And we have that advantage here to some degree and continue to see demographic trends. And I think that the strategy or the focus, broadly speaking, from economic development standpoints, isn't on getting that next big HQ. It's just not a strength that we have or a focus, but I think it's more on where we, and actually, Skip was part of starting it, right? The Portland Seed Fund. It's this creating the ecosystem to foster the next growth business that we are doing much better on than a decade ago when we endeavored to do so. So I actually think the venture scene and the ability to create startups, watch them fail and then recreate themselves and grow is probably where the future is for economic development and job creation versus get that big headquarters here.
Okay, and I'm going to finish by taking a question in the chat from Kay Abramowitz. She asked, what are steps ordinary people can take that will be effective in narrowing the rich-poor divide in technology? Skip?
Yeah, I would say that getting involved in programs like Free Geek, which could include volunteering and mentoring if you have some skills to bring to the table in terms of computer repair operations, also donating devices. And I think as well that there's an opportunity to kind of lend your voice from an advocacy standpoint, to let your elected official, state and local, know how important these issues are, including federal for that matter. I think that, that's not lost on me when I mentioned earlier how, sentiment had shifted across the legislature and all the elected officials were talking about the importance of connectivity. It wasn't because they suddenly read something that was really compelling. It was that they had thousands of constituents hammering their phone lines and email inboxes saying, hey, where's my connectivity?
Okay, yeah. Okay, well, listen, friends, we're a little bit past our time. If this were a real event, we would be adjourning to the main dining room right now, and Andrew and Skip would be getting a free dinner. We'll have to think of another way, and we will think of another way, gentlemen, of really expressing our gratitude to both of you for being part of a really interesting conversation. I'll remind everyone again that the speaker series is going to probably keep on the theme of Portland's future in many different aspects over the next year or so, and we'll ask you to keep an eye on our schedule. We'll have an announcement in not too long from now about what our October program is. So thank you. I want to thank Shelley for masterminding this from behind the scenes. I thank all of you who participated with questions. And once again, thank you, Andrew and Skip. And we wish everybody a really good night.